In the 19th century, two colossal empires stood on the brink of a world war. But this war would not be fought by grand armies or thundering cannons. It would be fought in secret, in the vast, unforgiving wildernesses of Central Asia. It was a war of spies and whispers, of courage and cunning, a shadow war for the fate of the world. They called it the Great Game. And the fate of millions rested on the nerve of a handful of British officers, alone, in disguise, hundreds of miles from home, with only their wits as their weapon. Their mission: to stop the relentless march of the Russian bear towards the crown jewel of the British Empire, India. They were the first, the original, the archetypal gentleman spies. And this is their story. By the end of this video, you will understand how these real-life super spies defeated an empire and secured the world for Britain using nothing but their genius and sheer, indomitable grit. The year is 1800. The British Empire, master of the seas, has secured its ultimate prize: India, a subcontinent teeming with unimaginable wealth, manpower, and resources. It is the engine of Britain's global power, the jewel in its imperial crown. To lose it would be unthinkable. But thousands of miles to the north, another empire is on the move: the Russian Empire, a vast, autocratic, land-based behemoth, driven by a centuries-old ambition to expand southwards, towards the warm water ports of the Indian Ocean. Every year, its borders creep further and further, swallowing the ancient khanates of Central Asia, digesting thousands of square miles of territory, and pushing ever closer to the northern frontiers of British India. A collision is inevitable. The British see the Russian advance not just as a threat, but as an existential crisis. The fear of a Russian invasion, a vast army pouring through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, becomes a national obsession, a paranoia that grips the minds of viceroys and prime ministers in Calcutta and London. They know they cannot move a conventional army across the hostile deserts and mountains to meet the threat head-on. The distances are too vast, the terrain too brutal. A new kind of warfare is needed. A new kind of warrior must be forged. So begins the most audacious espionage operation in history. Britain unleashes a weapon the likes of which the world has never seen: the Imperial Agent. These are not just soldiers. They are explorers, linguists, cartographers, and masters of disguise. Men like Alexander Burns and Arthur Connolly. They are given a simple, near impossible mission: go deep into the unmapped, hostile territories between the empires and stop the Russians. Alone. For months, sometimes years, they disappear. They shed their British identities, adopting the disguises of horse traders, Muslim holy men, or local merchants. They master Persian and Pashto. They carry nothing but a few scientific instruments, a sextant, a compass, hidden within their robes, and a mind filled with imperial purpose. Their task is to fill in the blank spaces on the map, to chart the secret mountain passes, and survey the desert wells that a future British army might need. They must gauge the loyalties of treacherous emirs and tribal warlords, determining who can be bought with British gold and who is already in the pocket of the Tsar. Most importantly, they must track, disrupt, and counter the moves of their Russian counterparts, who are playing the very same game. This shadow war, this tournament of shadows, as the Russians called it, is fought not with bullets, but with bribes, deception, and intelligence. A British agent might arrive at the court of the Emir of Bukhara only to find a Russian envoy has just left, having promised a shipment of modern rifles. It is a relentless, deadly game of one-upmanship, played on a chessboard the size of a continent. Arthur Connolly, the man who coined the very phrase, the Great Game, was one of its most daring players. He understood that this was a new kind of conflict, a battle for influence, a struggle to win the hearts and minds of the powerful men who ruled the lands between the empires. His journeys took him thousands of miles, through Persia and into the heart of Central Asia. But the game had its price. The lands they operated in were lawless and savage. The emirs they dealt with were notoriously cruel and fickle. In 1842, Connolly, along with fellow officer Charles Stoddart, was thrown into a vermin-infested pit in Bukhara on the orders of the emir, Nasrullah Khan. For months, they endured starvation and torture, before finally being dragged out and publicly beheaded. Their death sent a shockwave through the British Empire. It was a brutal reminder of the terrifying dangers these agents faced. Yet for every man who fell, another was ready to take his place. Alexander Burnes, known as Bokhara Burnes, was another legend of the game. Fluent in Persian, he travelled in disguise to the court of Kabul in Afghanistan, a kingdom that was becoming the central focus of the entire conflict. His mission was to secure an alliance with its ruler, Dost Muhammad Khan. But British policy, driven by paranoia and poor intelligence, catastrophically failed. Ignoring Burnes's expert advice, London decided it could not trust Dost Muhammad. In 1839, Britain made its worst blunder of the entire century-long conflict. It invaded Afghanistan. The First Anglo-Afghan War was a disaster born of arrogance. The British Army installed a puppet ruler in Kabul, but the Afghan tribes rose up in a furious rebellion. Alexander Burnes was hacked to pieces by a mob. The British garrison, attempting to retreat from Kabul, was annihilated in the frozen mountain passes. Of the 16,000 soldiers and civilians who began the retreat, only one man, Dr. William Brydon, made it back to British India. This colossal failure proved that conventional armies were useless here. It was a bloody, humiliating lesson. The great game could only be won by the spies, by the Imperial Agents who understood the land and its people. For the next 40 years, they redoubled their efforts. They learned from their mistakes. They charted the frontiers, they cemented alliances, and they built a vast network of intelligence that became the envy of the world. The climax finally came in 1885. At a remote oasis called Panjda on the Afghan border, Russian troops advanced and seized the territory, killing hundreds of Afghan soldiers. This was the moment the world had been dreading. The Russian bear was now at the very gates of India. The two empires stood eyeball to eyeball, on the absolute brink of all-out war. Newspapers in London screamed for blood. The Royal Navy was mobilised. But this time, Britain did not panic. This time, it was ready. Decades of patient, dangerous work by the agents of the Great Game had paid off. Britain knew the terrain. It had the alliances. It had the intelligence. Armed with this knowledge, the British government held its nerve. Through sheer diplomatic force, backed by the credible threat of a global war it knew it could win, Britain drew a line in the sand. And Russia, for the first time, backed down. There was no battle. There was no grand war. But the victory was absolute. The Great Game had been won. The Great Game was more than just a victory for the British Empire. It was the birth of modern espionage. The handful of audacious officers who played the game wrote the rule book for secret intelligence operations. For nearly a century, they had held the line. They secured the jewel of India, defined the borders of modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, and proved that a few brilliant, determined individuals could shape the destiny of nations. They demonstrated that intelligence, influence, and strategic cunning could be far more powerful than the largest of armies. But the game never truly ended. It simply evolved. The tournament of shadows between Britain and Russia was the direct forerunner to the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The same methods of proxy wars, espionage, and the struggle for influence were played out on a global scale. And today, in the 21st century, a new great game is being played in the very same lands. New players have joined the contest. China, with its vast economic ambitions, a resurgent Russia, seeking to reclaim its old sphere of influence. The United States, striving to maintain its global power. The chessboard is the same. The stakes are just as high. The legacy of those first Imperial agents, the men who walked into the wilderness alone, is all around us. They are not just figures from history. They are a symbol of a uniquely British brand of genius and defiance. They represent the unwavering belief that a single courageous individual, armed with intelligence and an indomitable will, can face down an empire and change the course of history. They prove to the world that the most important battles are not always fought by the biggest armies.